Okay, I think that we can begin while we wait maybe for a few extra students who might arrive now. Well, first of all, welcome back to class after the break. Many among you have taken the partial exam. I will discuss in class the exam, not next week, because next week we won't have class, the week after that, and you will receive the marks around that time. Those of you who did the descriptive report will receive the marks, I think, in a few days. Sorry, is there a problem? No. Okay, so somebody wanted to signal a problem? No. Okay, the reason why I'm keeping the microphone in this way, which I hope doesn't create problems with the remote recording and whatever, is that, of course, today we have the presentation in class of a selection of descriptive reports. Again, you will get the marks in a few days. As you know, the presentation doesn't add up to the mark, so only the actual report is evaluated, but still, those of you who will be lucky enough to be selected will have to present now using this microphone, which is the only one which works. And I prepared this kind of urn, which is a marmalade can, of course. And now we will select, I think, 2. And the privilege of selecting goes to the first row students. We choose 1. Very difficult. And 1, you, so we also, yeah, so we also ensure perfect gender parity in the selection. Okay, give it to me. Or do you want to announce that? Do that.
Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, what's the...
Nilufer Uludag, sorry for butchering.
So is Uludag here in class? You are. Huh? Yeah, it's you. So if you have a presentation and you want to put it on the... You can send it to you, and then you have to get into your email from there and download it, right? And then I will show you how you can share it. And the second winner is?
Samuel Karaba, about Japan.
Is someone in class? Yes, fantastic. So you two come, and if you have a USB key or whatever, you can use that. Otherwise, you send it to your email, right? And that's it for now. Let's see whether maybe we'll have time for a third. Who knows? Your USB? Fantastic. So it should be there. Now we need to share the file. Share files. File. Okay. This is your key. That's Japan. Aha, the PowerPoint. Let's hope it will be converted.
I can turn it into PDF if you want it, so that it's, I guess, might be easier.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, but we can do that on this computer, so that will be quicker. Why I can't? Sorry, so it's here. So I'll do that directly on your, okay. And I would like to remind to both students who are going to present that you will have exactly 7 minutes for your presentation, okay? As per agreements. Okay, now I'll close this. And I have to do this because otherwise the students will not see it. Okay. In the meantime, you will have to, you can pinch this if you want, or you have to keep this close to your mouth, and this you can maybe put in your pocket if you want, or okay, and to move the slides, you can use this.
Yes, there. Sorry? Excuse me?
Anyway, I will start the computer. Okay, you can begin.
Okay, hello everyone. I've decided to speak about Japan regarding the topic of the Great Divergence. And I think the best way to start is talk about why exactly I think Japan is a worthy country to discuss in this context. So to begin, basically the idea is, for me, was that since the topic of Great Divergence typically focuses on the Western Europe and later some of their colonies, such as, let's say, the United States of America or Canada, countries such as Japan, would make for a good example to focus on a different part of the world during this time period. And especially as well, since Pomeranz questioned the myth of European superiority, where on the one hand, there was the possibility of West's long-term development and economic features, whereas basically the other one was that there were particularly contingent factors that have enabled Western European countries to develop in the way they did. And another one was that Japan is hardly mentioned in a non-quantitative context because most of the time, from what I've read in the reports, the focus is purely on comparing GDP per capita data, which some mention is quite unreliable. And even though they try to correct for this, I think it's a much better idea to look at it more qualitatively and look at deeper insights within the country to look at what the economic situation and social situation within the country actually was. So now going on to actually talk about the peculiar case of Japan. Basically, the thing is, throughout the period of what we talk about the Great Divergence, throughout most of this time period, Japan was under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan from, as you can see, 1603 till 1867. And this period has been marked by peace, cultural prosperity, and strict social order, as there was a class system where most of the people were actually classified as peasants. And because of this ruling family and of the shogunate, starting with the 1630s, Japan became very isolated compared to the rest of the world, whereas previously they've, as we will be able to see, traded with, for example, Portugal, but after that, there was basically only one exception, which was an artificial island of Dejima, from which there was an inflow of ideas of using Dutch traders. However, as I've read, many argue that this touch with Western ideas and sort of also technologies helped to enable quick industrialization once this curtain has been lifted, and that has enabled Japan to emerge as a great power. Okay, so before Japan has become isolated, many argued that it has enjoyed high living standard and economic growth. However, what some have dubbed as one of the biggest economic policy mistakes ever committed, they decided to implement extremely restrictive trade policy out of fear of Europeans and Catholicism as well, which caused many of them to be pursued, and also there was persecution of Christians. So basically what we can say is that institutions limited the exploitation of well-functioning and integrated markets which were present in Japan and which are necessary for economic growth. As a result, it was unable for Japan for them to expand beyond their national and continental boundaries, as was the case with Western European powers during this time period. And it has also prevented competition, which then resulted that there was not as much specialization and economic growth. And this means that Japan was not able to benefit from the associated benefits, which, although significant, apparently weren't as big as others have believed. So now looking within the Far East itself, the interesting thing is that while the Far East in general has been left behind Europe, because other countries as well have implemented this sort of isolationist policy, Japan has still managed to overtake them, specifically China and India, in the so-called Asian Little Divergence. However, since their starting GDP per capita was somewhat lower compared to the Western European countries, and the growth was lower as well, basically the most developing part of Asia fell behind the entirety of Western Europe. However, since Japan grew, achieved long-term economic growth during this period, it laid solid foundations for the future once this period ended. So first, during the Sengoku period, which preceded the shogunate, there was more direct management of land, which was necessary because of the constant conflicts, and there was increase in productivity in cultivated area. There were also some industrial improvements related to this due to the forging of weapons and building of stone castles. However, there was also especially significant growth in the tertiary sector and commerce because of the Portuguese trade, which I've already mentioned, which led to an increase in urbanization. However, this avenue would be restricted afterwards somewhat because of the previously mentioned restrictionist trade policies. Then during the early Tokugawa period, as I told, around 1630s, they started to become more isolationist. However, this period saw an even greater postal population growth, which combined with the aforementioned isolationism restricted the quantitative growth of GDP per capita. However, as there were as many conflicts and basically the samurai have been settled into the castles, around these sort of cities or castle towns, there was a growth and expansion of commerce, which has also been aided by implementation of several reforms enabled by basically unified rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. Then during the late period, there was a stabilization of population, which of course also enabled increase in GDP per capita, and the late decades when, especially after the reopening of Japan, saw strong growth in secondary and tertiary sectors. However, for most of the period, there was a focus on proto-industrial economy, which emerged from rural central development, which I'll talk about more closely because it is very important in this context. So basically, it started with agricultural developments that necessitated market institutions, which although were different from the West, were very important in preconditioning the later Meiji boom. And basically the rural focus was that there were these rural communities focused on self-sufficiency, and basically all desirable goods were produced within the household. And since essentially the only way of spending free time was to focus on producing more in terms of agriculture, there was division of labor to maximize the benefit of the family in terms of what has been produced. And what this meant that this work ethic, together with promotion of state national market, planted the seed for the later Meiji growth. So in conclusion, the story of Japan is one of success, which however has been overshadowed by that of the West because it has been much more significant. Japan in general has been restricted by lack of global trade through its institutional isolation. However, the local environment allowed for the emergence of proto-industrial economy, which enabled Japan to be well suited for future rapid industrialization. Thank you. That's it. Just that I muted the microphone temporarily so they couldn't hear your question.
Yeah, right, you said that there was a very strict policy about trade, but which kind of trade was still possible with the foreigners in particular? Which kind and where?
I mean, from what I've read, basically most most trade was of the pirate kind because there were obviously many people who did not abide by the rules, even though basically if someone was caught, they'd be punishable by death. And the same was true if some Japanese people left the country and so on. But as I said, for essentially most of the time period, that artificial island of Dejima was the only place through which some sort of ideas on or Western literature was able to flow in, which then they later studied.
Now, in a few seconds, we move to the other presentation. Did you get it?
I signed out with your account, but it's still signed
No, I think the problem is that we should shut down everything, which doesn't work well, of course.
Can I just send it to your email?
You can, yes, do that.
Can I use this card?
Yes. You could help.
I mean, it doesn't really matter. But I think
No, it has already been uploaded in the system.
okay, thank you.
So you sent it to me? Yes.
Did you not send it properly?
No, yes, it's the system which might make an automatic scan. So as you have just sent it, in the meantime, you can get used to this.
Hi.
To keep this closed.
Okay.
Should be fine for system. Okay, fantastic. You have to move
From there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
whenever you want, you can do it.
Okay.
Remember to keep the microphone close to us.
Hi, today I'm going to shortly talk about the Ottoman Empire, which I chose firstly because I'm Turkish, and secondly because during the period in which it was an empire, it had quite a significant position in the world, but Turkey currently is a country on the periphery. So the Ottoman Empire was formed in northwestern Anatolia in a city called Bursa at the end of the 13th century, and it was formed by some men from nomadic Turkish tribes who originate in Central Asia. They were attracted like in the southwestern direction because during the time the Arabs were quite rich. They were experiencing the Islamic Golden Ages, and they were at the forefront of trade, scientific development, and philosophical thought. For quite a while, they tried to conquer Constantinople, and Fatih Sultan Mehmed in 1453 finally was able to do this, and that ends the Byzantine Empire. As we've seen in class, the Ottomans at this time were starting to become a threat to the West because they were gaining more and more land and also gaining more and more of the trade. The empire reaches its peak during the reign of Suleiman I, who was also known as Suleiman the Magnificent. And as you can see, they were able to get quite a bit of Europe as well. And the expansion stopped after the failed siege of Vienna. At this point, the empire was really becoming a big threat for the West. And I assume that all the Europeans were pretty happy when they weren't able to gain Vienna. After this period, the Ottomans become quite content in their place in the world, and they actually start to decline. They first start losing land at the end of the 17th century, and during the 18th century, the empire is still overconfident in its abilities because it had such a successful few centuries beforehand. And during the period the Europeans in the West is really developing, the Ottomans sort of stay where they are, and they don't really follow the new trends going in the world. So they have a weakening military, as can be seen by the lands which start to be lost during the end of the 17th century. And especially in terms of like the policies they were implementing, it was quite different to what was going on in the world, and they weren't implementing new policies to follow them. For example, the Ottoman economic policies were mainly based on Islamic and Iranian traditions. The Islamic economic thought was based on, making sure you don't exploit others for profit. And the Iranian system was more based on a state-managed economy. And these policies really weren't fit for the period. There was also instability in the Balkans, and it was a vast empire, and it wasn't really centralized that much, especially in terms of like economic unity in the empire. And the bureaucrats also declining in quality, so the state in Constantinople wasn't really able to have good control over the empire. One author in the literature puts the economic thought at the time of the empire under 3 headings, and these sort of give a good idea of why they weren't really able to hold their position. It was provisionism, which focused on imports rather than exports, so they gave more importance to there being a lot of imports in the country rather than there being exports. Fiscalism, which gave importance to the state and high taxes, and traditionalism. And this was basically making sure they had a clear hierarchy in the society, and also meant that they were sort of against new merchants becoming rich, which is quite different to what was happening in Europe. In the 19th century, the Ottomans finally realized that they're falling behind and that they should probably implement some drastic reforms in order to not be absolute. And these reforms are named the Tazminat. However, these reforms don't really work. This is partially because even the bureaucrats who believed in the reforms didn't want to give up on the status quo. For example, the new reforms meant that a bureaucrat did not have such an elite position as they did before, and the bureaucrats didn't really want to change their positioning in society. Also at the time, because they hadn't been able to keep up with the economic developments in the world, they weren't able to benefit from the globalization going on as well. At the end of World War I, the empire becomes obsolete, and the Turkish Republic takes its place, and an empire that once spanned quite a large area in, the Eastern Europe, Western Asia, is only confined to Anatolia and is only a peripheral country in the economic system. That's that's it. If there are any questions.
So we have actually saved some time. So do you have questions for your colleague? Yes.
I didn't understand how
Well, partially, so the country was focused on imports rather than exports. So it, like, even while the other countries were sort of beginning to industrialize and move from an agrarian society, the empire sort of stayed an agrarian society and just produced agriculture rather than developing its industry. And if it had focused on exports more, maybe they would have, you know, focused on developing other industries.
Okay, so normally I would at this stage go for another round of presentations, but as we are still kind of in a transition phase with COVID and the practicalities are slightly more complicated, I think that we actually don't have the time, which is a pity because I'm sure that all the students here would love to present their descriptive report. So I apologize if you don't have the opportunity to do that, but the good thing is that all of you will be given the opportunity of presenting at the end of the course, right? Now, regarding that, just 1 second. Sorry, so these are the, okay. Okay, I trust that everybody from home can hear me. So I was saying, regarding the presentation of the group works at the end of class, I wanted to tell you that tomorrow morning, so the first lecture, because you know that the second one will be with our guest teacher, John Ira Levy. So in the first one at 8:30, I will discuss with you the, you know, how you have to write prepare the research project and so forth and so on. Okay. I don't know whether you have already started thinking about the topics and maybe, more importantly, maybe the groups that you want to work with, but we are still not in a hurry. I wonder whether one of the students forgot glasses on the board here. Yeah, just, you know, take them in order to avoid forgetting them at the end of class. You can come. And okay, so apart from this, today, instead of resuming exactly where we stopped, which, if you remember, was the kind of the discussion of the drivers of inequality growth in pre-industrial times, instead of doing that, we will kind of move forward a bit, because I want to make sure that by when we'll have John Levy's lecture, we'll also have covered with, you know, proper and given a proper degree of attention the issue of globalization towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So we'll cover that part of the program. Then when we'll have to move on, we'll have to move into the study of inequality trends in the modern era, in the 19th, 20th century, we will actually complete also that part about the pre-industrial period. Okay, so we will move to inequality and complete the pre-industrial, and then move into the 19th, 20th century. But for now, we are simply kind of moving forward with the topics. Now, I've told you many times that basically in this course, the Industrial Revolution is the kind of elephant in the room, because we don't have the time in a course such as this to talk extensively about the Industrial Revolution proper, and that actually could be the object of a complete course onto its own. On top of that, for those of you who did the bachelor at Bocconi, that should have been kind of the main topic of the compulsory course in economic history in the bachelor. But we have instead referred, generally speaking, to the Industrial Revolution as a specific historical phase in which we know that, at the very least, divergence between Western Europe and other parts of the world, even the most advanced, tends to increase. So the distance between the West and the rest, and even simply between Western Europe and East Asia, tends to increase. Or even, and this would be Pomerantz's take on the topic, this is the actual moment when the great divergence begins. So in this other view, which places at a relatively late moment in time the onset of divergence, we have that the Industrial Revolution is actually the cause of divergence itself. Now, there is no doubt whatsoever that the Industrial Revolution starts in the northwestern part of Europe. So if you remember our discussion of the little divergence, whatever we think about the timing of the little divergence, whether it is something which begins in the 14th century, the early 16th, or the 17th century, and again, most scholars would place that at in between the early 16th and the early 17th century. There is no doubt, however, that at the beginning of the 18th century, in one specific part of the world, which is England, this process begins. So from our point of view, from the point of view of the little divergence, we can also look at the Industrial Revolution as the outcome of divergence. We look at preceding historical change as something which basically prepares the Industrial Revolution. Think, for example, of De Vries' view about an industrial revolution in the 17th century mostly, beginning with the late 16th, in fact, which precedes and prepares the Industrial Revolution. Or think about the long-run impact of those tendencies towards the development of different family systems in the northwest of Europe and in the south of Europe, which again, according to Heinal and a long series of scholars who have followed in instead, might have determined this tendency for quicker growth and set in motion actually those social economic changes which would have allowed for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Remember that actually, if you want to give kind of an extreme interpretation of Heinal, you can say those differences in family systems are those which actually trigger Industrial Revolution, because they tend to make the young especially more innovating, kind of more propense to risk in new endeavors, and also more mobile. So when there is somebody who comes up with an idea and needs workers, they will also be kind of better able to attract workers wherever they decide to establish the new factory, right? And again, this is, however, the Industrial Revolution per se, so as an historical process which is transformative of society and economy, the Industrial Revolution per se is background knowledge in this course. And if you think that you don't know enough, you come to me and I will give you something short to read, as I told you at the beginning of the course. So this is background knowledge, but still we are interested in considering, in a kind of deeper way, the overall significance of the Industrial Revolution proper per the our understanding of the little divergence and the great divergence, actually. So in this slide, you have Britain, Holland, Italy, and Spain. You have then the Northern European areas and the Southern European areas. The Industrial Revolution begins, say, circa 1720, if you want an exact point on this graph. It begins in the first decades of the 18th century in England. And this is actually, 1720 is actually the moment when, according to the most recent estimates, Britain, or also even only England strictly speaking, overcomes Italy in terms of per capita GDP. Now, what does this mean for our understanding of general relative levels of development? This means that the kind of relatively advanced situation and the relatively high levels of development reached by Italy already at the end of the Middle Ages, so from the 14th and 15th century, were kind of long-lasting and very difficult for the North European countries to overcome till the 18th century. Now, of course, the problem here is the following. Italy is not Italy, so this is one of those graphs which I always challenge, because as you know, Italy here is instead, we should know this by now, it's not Italy, but it is, who said Genoa? It's central northern Italy, actually. For the earlier phases, it's mostly Tuscany, okay? So it's central northern Italy, meaning where this Italy as a whole, the level would presumably be a little bit lower, right? Because as far as we know, but we don't have precise estimates, nor actually very satisfying studies, but as far as we know, there was already some difference in levels of development between North and South. We aren't exactly sure about the 14th century, but from the beginning of the 16th century, there are some signs that this was the case, but this is a topic which remains highly debated in among Italian economic historians, actually. And then you see that there is one part of the world which overcomes central northern Italy from earlier, according to this reconstruction, from the beginning of the 16th century, and that's Holland. Now, the scale of this graph is the logarithmic scale. This means that all differences kind of tend to be, I mean, the magnitude as it is visible in the graph tends to be diminished, okay? So each increase is actually more significant. Now, the point is that Holland is not the whole of the Northern Law countries. So, yes, there is a significant difference between Holland already in this estimate from the end of the 16th century compared to Central and Northern Italy. But it's like taking the most advanced part of the area, of the Low countries, and comparing that to the whole of Central and Northern Italy, at least on principle, because then in practice we should go and look at what exactly is covered by the Central and Northern Italian series for each period, so the matter is even more complicated. But on principle, this is not the whole of the Low countries, but what in the 17th century will be the most advanced part of the Low countries, and already in earlier periods was clearly one of the most advanced parts of the Low countries. So with this caveat, here we have that the little divergence begins earlier than the Industrial Revolution. But only, if we believe this, then only with the Industrial Revolution, Britain overcomes the most advanced part of Southern Europe. Okay? So the kind of argument we made about the Industrial Revolution deepening the great divergence can be made in similar ways also about the little divergence, right? Again, problem here, these estimates change continuously because they are still quite unstable in the sense that every now and then some scholar comes up with a new and presumably better estimate. And so, you know, it's not like we can decide all historical questions which are relevant for discourse based on a graph like this. Huh? Now, if I wanted to continue focusing on the significance of the Industrial Revolution for our understanding of the great divergence and the little divergence, I could show you this other graph. These are the older estimates produced by Angus Madison. In these older estimates, the kind of deep orange line is Britain, and you see that while the azure or light blue line is Italy, and you see that in the older estimates, England, or Britain actually, was overcoming Italy already from the middle of the 17th century. Now, especially for Britain, the currently available estimates of per capita GDP are strictly superior to those used by Madison, because they've been the object of a very big research project, whose outcome is a nice book specifically on this topic, which makes use of virtually all the historical information which was available to that point. So the book is updated to, when was that? Maybe 7 or 8 years ago. Okay. So you know, this is kind of probably wrong. But here again, you see that by the middle of the 18th century, with the Industrial Revolution, the distance between Britain and the other countries was deepening. And then with the second Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, you know, the first Industrial Revolution begins in England in the early 18th century, then it starts spreading to the European continent from the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, beginning with specific areas, in particular Belgium, for example, Switzerland. And then it is only with the second Industrial Revolution that other parts of continental Europe join this process, including Italy and Germany, for example. And with the second Industrial Revolution, we see more clearly a divergence between the wall of the West and the wall of the East. So other parts of the West join the great divergence, in this case, in that specific moment in time. The second Industrial Revolution is deeply different from the first, looking at the sectors which are involved. They are sectors which, generally speaking, require more technology, more scientific knowledge. They are, for example, the sector of electricity or that of steel in the middle of the century. And these sectors, and of course also industrial chemistry, and these sectors allow countries which had remained kind of in the backstage of the first phase of the Industrial Revolution to join the group. The only country, what is the only, well, who's the student who, so you are Japan, right? How would you comment this looking at the case of Japan?
Since the country basically opens its borders in 1853, one can see that it basically coincides with the Second Industrial Revolution, and that's basically also why the medicine industry comes.
Right. So your colleague, I repeat for students at home, says Japan opens its border in 1853. That's the Meiji Restoration. It promotes industrialization from the top. It's the government who actually promotes industrialization. And Japan is the only country in Asia which starts becoming an industrial country already in this phase. It's the first country in Asia which goes through a process of industrialization. It's the only country in Asia which, as you see, joins the Western European countries in this process of relative growth, which of course also leads Japan to diverge compared to China and compared to India in this period. And there's the second Industrial Revolution, which offers Japan this opportunity. Japan, which we have, as we have seen in the centuries before, has been presumably slipping behind in relative terms compared to Western Europe, not compared to the other parts of Asia, but surely compared to the most advanced part of Western Europe. Now, here you have a long time frame, 1500 to 1950. How does this picture look if we move further in time? Here we have 1820 to 1998, right? We have some countries growing much richer in terms of per capita GDP compared to the countries which remain poor. With the extremes are the United States and an average of African countries at the bottom. And you see that also in the case of Japan, so the point is that if you cut to this period, you are factoring in further divergence in the second half of the 20th century. Now, this divergence we will focus on in the upcoming weeks. We will look into this, we will look into the factors which shape this and the actual impact that this has on international inequality measured in different ways, which we already started to discuss in class. Now, where is China here? Wanted to say something? No, yeah. Exactly, it's Asia excluding Japan. Now, the point is, the growth of Asia excluding Japan in that period, especially in the last period, is mostly China plus, to some degree, India. The point is, if we could single out China, which this graph doesn't do, so I haven't produced this graph, I kind of took it, we would see China already from the end of the period at a higher rate. But China is then in the first decades of the 21st century, which really starts to diverge compared to the rest of Asia, and quickly catching up with the Western countries and with Japan. Japan, as you know, is a country which for decades has had a relatively slow growth for a number of reasons which we can't discuss into details. Now, the last part of this story is what we will focus on in the final part of the course, at least in terms of looking at inequality trends around the world. Today, we have to say something more about the 19th century. The 19th century when, again, Britain was already an industrial country, and when, in the second part of the century, other European countries, plus the United States, of course, also go through the industrialization process. Now, when we say Britain in the 19th century, of course, we are talking about a country which had built a very extensive global empire. This is the extension of the British Empire around 1890. Of course, the United States had already become independent, as you know, from the end of the 18th century. And this is the moment when the British Empire is at its maximum expansion, including India, in which Britain conquers during the 19th century, and including a large part of Africa, which is the object of colonial expansion in the second half of the 19th century, mostly, as you remember, maybe from one of our earlier lectures. Now, the point then, which we want to address, is also the following. When we think about a global empire of this kind, we are also thinking about a certain kind of global economy, which affects, of course, the interaction between the different parts of the empire, but also between those parts of the British Empire and other polities. And then the question for us becomes the connection between globalization, empire, and the Industrial Revolution. So a big historical question is to which degree the Industrial Revolution can be considered to have been the consequence, at least in part, or for a substantial part, which would be Pomeranz's view, of the colonial expansion of Britain. Now, the question is, of course, as you should know by now, very contentious, because if we underplay the importance of the Atlantic trade, so if we stick to the views that Pomeranz calls those of the European miracle view, if we stick to those views, which again underplay the importance of Atlantic trade, and maybe also highlight instead the importance of institutions, and there is a lot here to say about, there will be a lot to say about the views proposed by for example, the Utrecht School of Economic History about the importance of institutions in the economic expansion of the Low Countries, and then also of England. Well, if we do that, automatically we are kind of downplaying the importance of the empire for this process, and we get to a situation in which you can say, as Patrick O'Brien tended to say, before being kind of induced to moderate these by the research spawned by Pomeranz's book, he said, for the center, the periphery is peripheral, which means, okay, the real driver of change is what happens internally in Britain. This doesn't have to do with the empire, also because the importance of anti-trade was limited. Now, also those who hold that view, while they continue to argue this is not the crucial thing you want to look at, but still today accept the idea the Atlantic trade for the expansion of the center, so of Britain in this case, were however more important than they used to argue for in an earlier period. Now, Pomerantz, compared to this, offers a very different interpretation. And, you know, again, it's not like I'm telling you Patrick O'Brien is wrong and Pomerantz is right, or the opposite. These are contrasting views, and you can also place, you know, you can also imagine that you can have a variety of intermediate interpretations of this. But Pomerantz, as you know, argues that the exploitation of the New World and the additional resources that this exploitation was able to bring to Europe were a necessary condition for allowing one specific particularly advanced parts of the West, so Britain or England only, to overcome, to avoid falling into a kind of cul-de-sac of the kind that China falls into in this period. Because this is what allows Britain to gain access to additional resources which prevent it from focusing on the production of food on its mainland, focusing instead on other stuff and ultimately focusing on industry. Now, the problem here, however, is that Pomerantz also argues that this kind of system of colonial exploitation has some sort of quite clear negative connotation because it is hugely reliant upon the slaves who work the plantations. Now, apart from this, there is another thing that he argues, especially for the Caribbean area and the Central and Southern American area, and that's a tendency for the plantations to be placed close to the coasts. And he argues this is indicative of the fact that they were basically established to serve the interest of the mother country, because their produce was exported to Europe mostly, and then if you are placed close to the coast, you have low transportation costs, given that the ultimate objective is re-exporting the produce towards Europe. Now, why slaves? There are a number of reasons why slaves were so widely used. First of all, of course, there was the scarcity of workers in the New World after the demographic collapse of the native populations, especially in Central and Southern America. It is highly debated how much the population of these areas, the native population, shrank during the period immediately following the conquest. The high estimates are in the range of 80%. They are probably too high because demographically that's difficult to conceive something like that. But it's also true that we have other examples of demographic collapses for which the current estimates are in the range of 50% or even more. The Black Death is exactly such a case. Okay, so what is sure is that the scarcity of the labor force in the American area was, to a large degree, to a very large degree, the consequence of the demographic collapse of the native populations. Yes. Okay, no, that's a good, if I understood correctly, because from here for difficult to hear you, but I think it is a good point. So you're asking whether the British would have behaved differently if they had more native people available. Now, this point is made for now, especially for Central and South America. So the earlier phase of the slave import, but then it applies also to North America at a later phase. Now, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I would say on principle, yes, that's conceivable. But the point is that there were also additional reasons why the Europeans imported slaves. And there was a strong racist motivation here, which is that the Europeans did not perceive any obligations towards the imported slaves, the black slaves from Africa, precisely because they were bought from African kingdoms mostly, and they were not white. So this was a racist thing. In the case of the native populations, and I here refer to Central and South America in particular, at least on principle, the mandate of the colonizers was to bring them the Christian religion. And the establishment of the system which organized the labor of the natives, on principle, then reality might have been quite different, of course. It was very different in some cases. But on principle, it was a system in which there was an exchange. So they were receiving the Christian religion, which of course the Europeans believed was important to transfer them. And they had to offer laborers by means of corvées of various kinds, some of them in some areas like the Peru area, the area of the ex-Inca Empire, were actually very taxing for the natives. And this also, I think I discussed this in class with you. This is not, there was also, I mean, part of the demographic collapse, especially in an area like Peru, were not due to the actual death of the Indios people, but to the fact that the males were forced to work very far from home for very long periods of the year, and that drove down fertility. So it's not only a spike in mortality, there is also a drop in fertility, which contribute together to reduce the growth rates of the population by a large margin, driving that negative big time for a period. But on principle, at least on principle, the idea was one of an exchange. So these were not slaves. The Europeans had some obligations towards them. At least in certain areas, at least part of the Europeans were kind of trying to, you know, contain the plight of the native people. With the slaves imported from Africa, no, there wasn't anything like that. They were treated in, you know, extremely bad ways. We know that the mortality rates among the black population, the imported slaves in the plantations of the Caribbean area, was extremely high, which, by the way, tended to fuel continuously the re-import of new slaves. This is one reason why the numbers are so large. In certain areas, these people died quite quickly after they started working the plantations. Okay, so again, on principle, having greater native population density in place might have surely slowed down the onset of this system and reduced its final intensity. I don't think that this would have been entirely avoided by the Europeans for these reasons. And slaves were also much cheaper than the indentured servants, which basically were Europeans who wanted to migrate to a new world, and basically, in being unable to pay for the transit by ship, they committed themselves to work for a few years after arriving in the new world, and after that they became free to do whatever they wanted. So the economic conditions of the slave trade were actually promoting promoting the trade. And this is a point that Pomerantz makes also quite strongly. And again, the objective here is that he wants to highlight this negative character of the exploitation of this negative trait in the exploitation of the New World. Okay, so first, Europe wouldn't have been able, Europe or even only Britain, wouldn't have been able to take the path towards industrialization without having access to these overseas territories and their resources, and the abundance of the amount of resources which was possible to produce there and to export to Europe wouldn't be possible to obtain that without making an extensive use of slaves. Additionally, given that the economies of the colonies were set up to provide for the needs of the mother country, he also argues that this tended, especially again in Central and Southern America, the case of North America is slightly different, not slightly, it's different. This tended to make those areas in need of pretty much everything else, and this might have been a cause of relatively underdevelopment in the long run. The case of North America was different, and this actually was an advantage for England in a certain phase, especially when it started its colonial wars with other colonial powers in the area, in its American colonies, England was able to produce food enough to sustain its growing local population, while the Iberian powers had to import food from Europe to answer to a deficit in food production in their American colonies. Okay, so strict was the focus on the production of colonial goods for the mother country, that these areas were unable to even to become self-sufficient from the point of view of food production, which of course again made them lesser able to sustain development in the long run, but also made them more fragile, giving an edge to England when the matter becomes contrasting the presence of other colonial powers in the American area. Okay. I'll be quick about this. This is an excerpt from Pomerantz. The point is that here, for him, you have the establishment of a new kind of periphery. So think about world trade system, or even simply Brodel. So think about economic areas which are internally organized with a hierarchy, so with a core and a periphery. And the point is that this periphery for Pomerantz was new, so different from the peripheries which existed in earlier world systems or world economies, Brodel or Wallerstein, because you have the combination of demographic catastrophe, which empties these areas from local population, colonial legislation, so a production system which was set up to serve the interests of the mother country, and finally slavery, which again for Pomerantz is really a characterizing feature of this system. And just to give you an order of magnitude, according to some estimates, about 10 to 15 million enslaved people were brought from West Africa to the Americas between 1650 and 1860, but I have to tell you that the estimates of the number of slaves imported to the Americas are extremely varied. So you can find very different numbers. And again, this is one area in which there is a lot of research ongoing. It is pretty difficult to estimate that because of the sources we have, and because actually it's difficult to keep track of everything, and there is a lot of guesstimate involved for at least parts of this trade. Now, another feature of this, so the slave trade is a pretty important feature of this kind of global economy which starts developing in this phase. Another important feature is the movement of a specific product from the New World across the world, which are basically the precious metals, so gold, and then even more in time, silver. And this is because the trade of silver is much more complex. It becomes much more complex than what you might imagine if you only heard about the import of American silver from the Americas to the harbor of Seville in Spain, because then, sure, we find that part of that silver remains in Europe, but you also see that Europeans are using that silver to acquire some very high value products from what Pomeranz calls ecologically rich small market areas in the old world. So in Asia and also in some parts of Europe. So areas where specific products were available due to the local environment. Think about certain spices which had to be imported from Asia, like the nutmeg, for example. The nutmeg, the entire production of nutmeg, which in Italian is the noce moscata for the Italians who don't know the word, came originally from the Banda Islands, which were a small archipelago, and the Dutch in particular were quite very aggressive in securing control of the Banda Islands, avoiding that any other merchant, trying to avoid that any other merchant was able to buy the produce of nutmeg from these areas. So they kind of replace the Portuguese originally, and then they are very aggressive in trying to avoid the presence of the English traders in that specific area and economic activity. And then things become more complex, because then you have fluxes of silver which go to India and some other parts of Asia to buy manufactured products, which are then resold in Africa to buy slaves, which are then brought to the Americas. So silver going to, say, India in exchange for cloths, sold in exchange for slaves in Africa to be exported to the Americas. And you see that this is a kind of quite complex economic system which tends to span the globe, but which has some interesting connotations, right? Not something that you would expect. And then, of course, to areas like China, which produced commodities which were in high demand in Europe. Now, China, we already touched upon this issue in the 19th century and also before, was demanding a lot of silver because it was remonetizing its economy. So for Pomeranz, the point is they actually wanted silver, and the Europeans wanted the Chinese tea and other products of China. Now, the problem, however, is that the Europeans didn't like to send silver to China. And this will lead to additional changes in the colonial economy in India in particular, and also a change in the nature of the interaction between the Europeans and China, as we will see shortly. Before that, consider how the main world trade routes looked like circa 1750. I think this is a little bit later than the period that you covered in class, right? So we are moving forward in time, and by the middle of the 18th century, you already have something which is actually global in scale. It's not like each and every part of the world was involved in this, but you see, if you remember what I was telling you at the beginning of our discussion of the Great Divergence, if you remember when I was telling you, maybe by the middle of the 16th century, the product that is traded across the Atlantic trade routes is 1 part over 10,000, right? But this is important because this establishes the condition for the beginning of a process which continues in time and is apparently unstoppable, right? That's exactly what I mean. This is what developed by the middle of the 18th century. And then, of course, in the 19th century, you have further expansion of the integration of a certain kind of economic integration between different world areas, which is connected to the expansion of the European empires, right? When the Europeans acquired direct control of India and of large parts of Africa and of other parts of Asia, this became integrated in a different way into this, this system. Now, how important was this for Europe, which brings us back to the original question? So were these peripheric areas, but peripheric from the point of view of the economic hierarchies, important for the success of the center or not? Now, something which I find always very interesting is an exercise that Pomerantz does, which is estimating in terms of surfaces how much space Britain would have needed to produce certain specific imports from the colonies on its own territory. So if you do this exercise, and if you believe Pomerantz, which I'm sure has been criticized for this and whatever, but you know, he estimates that for producing the same amount of calories which came from sugar, when I say calorie, remember that this is still a kind of society in which calories, which of course are needed for human beings to be able to kind of exercise their strength, to work, right? Calories are scarce. So if you have a supplement in calories, the people which enjoy that can work harder and longer. Okay? Now, I think I told you, the minimum diet, especially in South Europe, but it wasn't very different in North Europe, was in the phases of highest population pressure of resources in early modern times, was basically bread and wine in the South, replace wine with mead or other kinds of beer in the north of Europe. And why is alcohol? Alcohol is alcohol provides additional calories, which are needed by those who have to do very physically taxing jobs. People working, for example, in the countryside during the harvest. We could discuss a lot the issue of alcoholism in European populations of early modern times, but we won't. I mean, that's a different, I mean, there was really a cultural difference there, but the amount of alcohol these people consumed would really impress you, so let's not talk about that. Now, Pomerantz estimates that to produce the same amount of calories locally, so in Britain, Britain would have needed in between 1.9 and 2.6 million additional acres. For cotton, this would have been even more. Cotton was a crucial raw material of the first industrial revolution. You know, the first industrial revolution begins with the textile sector, very much. That and mining, okay? But cotton was key. 23 million acres. Timber, which was scarce in Britain, just 1 additional million acres, but that's on top of everything else. So if you think that the total amount of arable land in Britain was 17 million acres, you are talking about an additional 25 to 30,000 ghost, it calls them ghost acres, which basically means adding 2 other Britons to the original island in terms of surfaces, right? Now, is this an estimation by excess? Maybe, I can't tell you, but even if that is, before getting to a situation in which really you can think that in this moment, access to these resources is not important for England appears a bit difficult if you take everything into account. So I think that point that Pomeranz make is quite convincing. And then, of course, you have the issue of coal. Coal was not imported, but coal was an additional advantage which Britain had and which distinguished it from other relatively advanced parts of Western Europe, which also had access to the colonies, but didn't have access to a local source of relatively cheap energy on a scale comparable to that of England, with an exception, which was Belgium, and that's maybe not by chance that Belgium is the first part of continental Europe which goes through the Industrial Revolution. Okay? And from that point of view, this focus on coal, again, works pretty well from certain points of view, which is not to say that, no, there aren't also some issues with Pomeranz interpretation. Now, of course, the independence of the American colonies, and here we, of course, refer to the American Revolution, to the Declaration of Independence from the colonizing power, caused some problems to England, to Britain, sorry, which didn't want to become too dependent for certain key raw materials from an ex-colony, and this led Britain, particularly Britain, to try and increase the production of those raw materials in its colonies in India, and also to promote that in Egypt, which was squarely in the British sphere of influence. So from this point of view, even after the independence of the United States, and then well into the 19th century, so till the end of the century, Pomeranz argues that the coercion, the exploitation of the colonies continues to be a characterizing feature of the European economic success. And again, you can also find many scholars who challenge this in a tradition which focuses instead on internal developments. Now, quickly, because this is something that we have already mentioned. This is what happens in Western Europe. What happens instead in the 19th century in the most advanced parts of East Asia, in particular in China and Japan, it happens that for Pomeranz, the constraint in the available resources, given that these countries did not have access to colonies, different from the European powers, leads to a situation in which it is impossible for them to feed a growing population without basically increasing the share of people working in the rural sector and not in the handicraft industry, in proto-industry, right? And he argues that in the Yangtze Delta, by around 1750, 16 to 21% of the population, in the Yangtze Delta, which was the most advanced part of India, you have a population which fails to grow additionally because they had hit the ceiling, because they weren't able to kind of increase further the production of foodstuffs. And in general, he argues that the China by 1850 was about as agrarian as 1750, and this wouldn't have changed much by the middle of the 20th century. So a long phase in which China basically is locked into a situation because of its problems in securing additional resources. By the way, the problem of securing resources, natural resources from the outside, continues to be a crucial geopolitical problem of China. When you hear about the economic expansion of China in Africa, we're talking exactly about that. Okay, China is a country which is extremely densely populated. It has, for many key resources, a problem in getting locally what it needs, and it has been trying to protect its ambitions, also to increase the prosperity of its population and to secure the possibility of growth of their local industries by securing access, by getting, by securing I mean by getting a privileged access to resources from other world areas. Again, especially in Africa, and there is also in parts of the West, at least, a growing concern for the geopolitical implications of this. Now, talking about geopolitics these days, for unfortunate and obvious reasons, is kind of commonplace. But the issue here, I mean, this kind of issue is quite clear and kind of taps into taps very well into the kind of discourse that Pomeranz tries to develop. Now, China, however, wasn't a British colony, of course. The British, as you will see, try and impose their will upon the Chinese in some respects, and we'll get to that soon, or maybe tomorrow morning. But India instead was, so India, which is conquered by the British beginning from the late 18th century, and then the conquest is completed during the 19th century when they acquire control over the entire Indian subcontinent, is entirely placed within the British colonial system. And the British, according to Pomeranz, but here there is a kind of significant literature on this, try and introduce a legislation, a colonial legislation, which can be read as serving the interests of the mother country, because it can easily be read in terms of being tried, being specifically aimed at keeping India in the position of a periphery, which was role is providing the mother country, or in general the English merchants, including those who traded with China, as we will see, with certain basic products and raw materials, and at the same time importing all the more complex goods from Britain. So there are a range of ways in which the British do this. They establish, for example, that weavers were bound to a single buyer. What does this mean? That the local proto-industry had to renounce the possibility of competing in the market, I mean, of exploiting competition between buyers or between European merchants to drive the prices up. So if they were bound to a single buyer, this means that that buyer, who was the European, was able to extract the greatest possible profit from the exchange with the weaver. Additionally, as we will see tomorrow, I think, in large parts of India, the production was, I mean, certain kinds of production were forcibly introduced, again, to serve the interest of the British, which are also geopolitical interests. This is especially relevant for to understand the expansion of the production of opium in India. The production of opium expands because the British want to sell opium to the Chinese in exchange for tea, in order to avoid a continuous outflux of silver from the British Empire towards India, sorry, towards China, and so forth and so on. The problem here is that all this legislation together was aimed at keeping the Indian economy, and maintaining the Indian economy at a certain relatively low level of development. It was favoring the agrarian sector compared to other sectors. Kind of evidence of this is the progressive reduction in urbanization rates in India in this period. So this means that a relatively larger share of population resides in the countryside and is involved with agrarian products. And then, of course, also the market of India is reserved as a tendency by the colonial legislation for the British producers. Now, I think that we can stop here and complete the discussion and return on the issue of the opium trade tomorrow. We have time maybe for one question. Are there questions? One question, a couple of questions maybe? No questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, today we can finish a couple of minutes early. Remember, tomorrow we're also going to talk about the group work at the first lecture in the morning, unfortunately at 8:30 then. So see you tomorrow, and I will stop recording now. Please, I hope you have recorded your attendance. I forgot to remind you of that. If you haven't, please do that now.